two black men confronted racist cops who threatened them with guns. The officers thought they could humiliate them with impunity, but they didn't realize they were detaining FBI agents. How did things change when the truth came out? Don't miss out. Subscribe to our channel to find out all the details. And write in the comments where you're watching this from. The hum of the highway was the only sound that accompanied the quiet contemplation of two men in a sleek, dark luxury sedan. The city was miles behind them, its bright lights fading in the rearview mirror, leaving nothing but an open stretch of road ahead. Captain Tyler Davis sat behind the wheel, his hands gripping the soft leather of the steering wheel with a certain calm confidence, though his mind was far from peaceful. Beside him, his partner and fellow agent, Jordan Blackwood, was silent, eyes focused on the seemingly endless road ahead. Their mission, which had already spanned several months, was nearing its critical point. The operation involved dismantling a vast international criminal network, one that had its tendrils in drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and organized crime. Tyler and Jordan, both seasoned agents of the FBI, had been working undercover to infiltrate the upper echelons of this organization. Tonight, they were returning from a crucial meeting with one of their most valuable informants. In the trunk of their car were documents and evidence that would soon help bring the criminal enterprise to its knees. They had finally acquired the proof they needed to make the arrests, yet the weight of the night hung heavily between them. They had spent hours reviewing the evidence with their contact, going over the intricate details that could make or break their case. Now, as the adrenaline from the meeting faded, a deeper tension settled in the car. This was their final stretch, the moment before everything would fall into place. But there was something about the quiet of the night, the vast emptiness of the road, that made both men uneasy. Tyler, the older of the two, was a man known for his composure. Even under the most intense pressure, he remained steady, his mind sharp and his emotions tightly controlled. He had to be. In his career, he had faced down criminals of every kind, walked into danger more times than he could count, and, despite it all, had always come out on top. His colleagues respected him not just for his skill, but for his resilience. Yet, despite the cool demeanor he maintained, Tyler was all too aware of the additional burden he carried as a black man in a predominantly white field. He had risen through the ranks through hard work and dedication, but no amount of success could fully shield him from the racism that persisted in the world around him, and in the system he had sworn to uphold. Jordan, sitting beside him, was younger and more vocal, though no less experienced. He had a sharp wit and a habit of speaking his mind, sometimes to his own detriment. Where Tyler often held back, Jordan let his emotions show. They balanced each other well, their partnership built on mutual trust and a shared understanding of the challenges they faced. Both men had been through enough together to know that in this line of work, trust was everything. "Long night," Jordan muttered, breaking the silence, his voice low but carrying the weight of the hours they'd just endured. Tyler glanced at him briefly, nodding. "Yeah, we're almost home." Home? The word felt distant. In their line of work, home was a fleeting concept, more an idea than a place. For now, though, it meant the safe house they'd been operating out of for the duration of this mission. A place where they could regroup, assess the situation, and prepare for the final phase of their operation. Jordan shifted in his seat, running a hand over his face as if to wipe away the fatigue that clung to him. "You think we got everything we need?" Tyler didn't answer right away. He knew the importance of the evidence they'd gathered tonight, but he also knew how fragile their situation was. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything could fall apart. And in their case, the stakes were even higher. Working as undercover agents was dangerous enough, but doing so, as black men in a system that often viewed them with suspicion, only added to the complexity. They had seen it too many times. How quickly a situation could turn. How easily they could go from being the ones in control to being the ones under scrutiny. "We'll know soon enough," Tyler finally said, his voice steady. "For now, we just need to get back in one piece." As they continued down the highway, the tension in the car remained, a quiet but persistent reminder of the danger that always seemed to lurk just beneath the surface. Tyler's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, scanning the road behind them out of habit. It was late, and the highway was mostly empty, save for a few scattered cars. Still, something didn't feel right. It was then that Tyler noticed the faint but unmistakable glow of blue and red lights in the distance behind them. "Jordan," Tyler said, his voice calm but with an edge of alertness, "we've got company." Jordan turned to look out the rear window, his eyes narrowing as he saw the flashing lights approaching. "Shit," he muttered under his breath. "We weren't speeding, were we?" "No," Tyler said, slowing the car slightly as the police vehicle closed in on them. "But that doesn't always matter." They both knew the reality of the situation. They had been stopped before, for reasons that had nothing to do with their driving or their adherence to the law. It was something every black man understood, especially those in positions of authority. Despite their badges, despite their credentials, there were still times when none of that seemed to matter. Tyler pulled the car over to the side of the road, the soft gravel crunching under the tires as they came to a stop. The police cruiser pulled up behind them, its lights casting an eerie glow through the back window. For a moment, neither Tyler nor Jordan spoke. They didn't need to. They both knew what this was. "Stay calm," Tyler said, more for himself than for Jordan. "We'll handle it." Jordan nodded, though Tyler could see the frustration already building in his partner's eyes. They had been through this before. Too many times. It never got easier. A moment later, the door of the police cruiser opened and two white officers stepped out, their silhouettes illuminated by the flashing lights. Tyler's gaze remained fixed on the rearview mirror, watching as the officers approached. Something about their posture, the way they moved, set off warning bells in his mind. This wasn't a routine stop. This was something else. The younger of the two officers, a tall, lean man with a sharp jawline, approached Tyler's window. His expression was hard, his eyes cold as they swept over the car. He didn't bother with the usual pleasantries. "License and registration," he barked, his voice lacking any hint of professionalism or courtesy. Tyler's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, but he remained composed. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced briefly at the interior of the car before returning his gaze to Tyler. "You were driving a little fast back there. Just need to check some things out." "We weren't speeding," Jordan said from the passenger seat, his voice sharp. The second officer, an older man with a stockier build, moved to Jordan's side of the car, his hand resting on the top of his holstered weapon. "License and registration," he repeated, his tone colder than his partner's. Jordan hesitated for a moment, his jaw clenched. He knew they hadn't done anything wrong, but the tension in the air was thick, and he could feel the situation slipping out of their control. Tyler nodded to him, silently telling him to comply. Jordan reached for his wallet, pulling out his ID and handing it to the officer with a controlled expression. Tyler did the same, passing his license and registration to the younger officer at his window. The officers took the documents and returned to their cruiser, leaving Tyler and Jordan sitting in the uncomfortable silence of their car, the flashing lights casting shadows across their faces. "This isn't routine," Jordan muttered, his voice low. Tyler nodded. "I know." Minutes passed, though it felt like much longer. The air in the car was thick with unspoken tension. They both knew how quickly this could go wrong. "I hate this shit," Jordan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every damn time." Tyler didn't respond. He didn't need to. He felt the same way. No matter how many times it happened, no matter how much success they achieved, there was always that lingering sense of dread when confronted by the wrong people in the wrong circumstances. It didn't matter that they were agents of the FBI. To these officers, they were just two black men in a nice car. The silence was finally broken by the sound of the officers returning. Tyler watched them in the rearview mirror as they approached once more, their expressions unreadable but their body language tense. "Step out of the vehicle," the younger officer ordered, his hand resting dangerously close to his holster. Tyler felt his stomach drop, though his expression remained impassive. This was bad. Very bad. "Can you tell us why?" Tyler asked, his voice measured. "You're acting suspiciously," the officer replied curtly, offering no further explanation. Tyler exchanged a glance with Jordan. This wasn't just a stop anymore. It was something more. Something much worse. As they opened their doors and stepped out of the car, the weight of the situation pressed down on them both. The night, once quiet and calm, had turned into something much darker, something dangerous. And deep down, Tyler knew exactly why. The cool night air hit Tyler's face as he stepped out of the car, but it did little to calm the rising tension within him. The flashing lights of the police cruiser behind him cast an unsettling glow on the empty road. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, a heavy, familiar sense of dread that came with every interaction like this. Beside him, Jordan moved with measured precision, mirroring Tyler's controlled movements as they stood next to their vehicle. The officers, however, exuded a different energy, one of thinly veiled hostility. Tyler could see it in their eyes, in the way their hands lingered near their weapons, in the sharpness of their words. It was clear from the outset that this wasn't about a routine traffic stop. This was personal, and it had nothing to do with the car they were driving or the speed at which they'd been going. "Turn around, hands on the car," barked the younger officer, whose name tag read Miller. Tyler's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He'd been in enough situations like this to know better. Compliance was often the best defense, at least until you could assess how far things would escalate. He turned, slowly, placing his hands on the cool metal of the car. Jordan did the same beside him, though Tyler could sense his partner's barely contained frustration. "Officer, can you please tell us what this is all about?" Jordan asked, his voice tense but controlled. Miller didn't bother to answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to Tyler, his breath hot on Tyler's neck as he frisked him. "You're acting suspiciously," Miller said finally, his tone dripping with disdain. It was the kind of vague, baseless accusation that carried weight in situations like this, the kind that was impossible to argue against without escalating things further. Tyler gritted his teeth as Miller's hands roughly patted him down. His mind raced, trying to calculate the next steps. This wasn't going to end quickly. He could feel it. On the other side of the car, the older officer, whose name tag read Brooks, was already handling Jordan with the same aggressive energy. Brooks was stockier, his movement slower but filled with the kind of deliberate intensity that made it clear he was searching for something, or rather hoping to find something that would justify the stop. "We weren't speeding," Jordan said, his voice low but firm. "You know that." Brooks shot him a look, one filled with thinly veiled contempt. "You talk too much," he muttered, his hands now rifling through Jordan's pockets. "Stay quiet." Tyler could feel the tension in Jordan rising, the restrained anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He knew Jordan well enough to recognize the signs, the way his partner's fists clenched at his sides, the controlled, measured breathing. Jordan was doing everything in his power not to let his emotions get the best of him. This wasn't their first time being stopped by overzealous officers. It wasn't even their 10th, but something about this felt different, more dangerous. There was a look in Miller's eyes, a kind of cold detachment that sent warning bells ringing in Tyler's mind. They were being profiled, no doubt about that, but this went beyond the usual harassment. These officers were looking for a reason, any reason, to escalate the situation further. "Turn around," Miller barked again, this time directing his command at both Tyler and Jordan. "Hands behind your back." Tyler's heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained impassive. He had been here before. He knew the drill, but the stakes were higher this time. If things went south, their entire operation could be compromised. They couldn't afford to make a wrong move. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be," Miller added, his voice dripping with condescension as he motioned for Tyler to step closer to the car. His hand hovered near his holster again, a not-so-subtle reminder of who held the power in this moment. Tyler didn't need the reminder. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him with every breath he took. He moved as instructed, placing his hands behind his back, his mind racing through possible scenarios. He and Jordan had spent months building their cover, months ensuring that no one knew they were federal agents. To blow that cover now, in the middle of a highway, because of a couple of racist cops? It wasn't an option. Not yet. Beside him, Jordan reluctantly followed suit, though his frustration was palpable. Tyler could see the tightness in his jaw, the way his shoulders tensed as Brooks approached with the same smug expression that Miller wore. "Look at this," Brooks said with a mocking grin as he gestured toward the car. "Two guys like you driving a car like this. Don't see that too often, do we, Miller?" Tyler's stomach churned with anger, but he kept his voice level. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," Brooks shot back, his smirk widening. "Just saying it's a little unusual, don't you think?" The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken prejudice. They both knew what Brooks was really saying, and it had nothing to do with the car. To him and Miller, Tyler and Jordan didn't belong. They didn't belong in that car, on that road, in that situation, and they were determined to make them pay for daring to be there. "Let's cut the crap," Jordan finally said, his voice low but filled with barely controlled fury. "You know damn well we're not criminals, so why don't you just tell us what this is really about?" Brooks stepped closer, his face inches from Jordan's. "You don't tell us how to do our jobs, boy," he snarled, his voice filled with venom. Tyler's muscles tensed at the word. It was a deliberate provocation, meant to rile them up, meant to push them to a breaking point. He had seen this tactic before. Escalate the situation until the victim snapped, then claim self-defense or use force as a necessary response. But he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. "Calm down, Jordan," Tyler said, his voice calm but commanding. He needed Jordan to keep his cool, no matter how much Brooks and Miller pushed. Jordan shot him a look, his eyes flashing with frustration. He hated being told to back down, especially when they both knew they were in the right. But he also knew Tyler was right. If they lost their composure, if they gave these officers any excuse to use force, things could spiral out of control in an instant. "Fine," Jordan muttered, though his eyes remained locked on Brooks. "But I'm not going to stay quiet if they keep this up." Tyler nodded, understanding. He felt the same rage bubbling beneath the surface, the same desire to fight back against the injustice of it all. But this wasn't the time. Not yet. Miller returned from the cruiser with their IDs and tossed them carelessly onto the hood of the car. "No outstanding warrants," he said, his tone laced with disappointment. "But that doesn't mean you're clean." "We didn't do anything wrong," Tyler replied, his voice measured. "So, unless you have probable cause—" "Probable cause?" Miller cut him off, a smug grin creeping across his face. "I don't need probable cause when you're acting suspiciously." It was a blatant lie, of course. Tyler knew the law better than anyone. He'd spent years enforcing it, after all. But that didn't matter. Not here. Not now. "What are you going to do?" Jordan asked, his voice sharp. "Search the car? Plant something?" Miller's grin widened. "Wouldn't be the first time I found something unexpected in a car like this." Tyler's pulse quickened. They were on dangerous ground now. If these officers were willing to lie, to fabricate evidence or worse, then this could end very badly. "We're not giving you permission to search the car," Tyler said firmly. "And unless you have a warrant, you're not touching anything." Miller took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You're in no position to make demands, buddy." Tyler's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the situation teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something irreversible. But he couldn't let these officers intimidate them into submission. "We know our rights," Tyler said, his voice firm but calm. "And you're overstepping." Miller's face darkened, the smug grin fading as he took another step forward. "Overstepping? You want to see overstepping? I can show you overstepping." The threat hung in the air, thick and heavy. Tyler could feel the tension building, the dangerous edge in Miller's voice that signaled just how far he was willing to go. "Enough of this bullshit," Brooks snapped, stepping back toward the cruiser. "We're searching the car, whether you like it or not." Tyler's stomach dropped. This was it. They were going to escalate. They were going to push this until it became something far worse. "We need to stop this," Jordan whispered, his voice filled with urgency. "I know," Tyler muttered, his mind racing. But what could they do? They couldn't reveal their identities, not without jeopardizing the entire mission. But if they didn't, these officers were going to take this too far. "Just hold on," Tyler said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We'll find a way out of this." But deep down, he wasn't sure how much longer they could hold on. The cold night air seemed to freeze in place as Officer Miller took another step toward Tyler, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of smug confidence and barely contained aggression. The situation had already spiraled far beyond what should have been a routine stop, and Tyler could feel the weight of each passing second pressing down on him. The darkness around them seemed to thicken, the empty road stretching endlessly in both directions, offering no sign of rescue, no witnesses to what was about to happen. Beside him, Jordan's posture grew more rigid. His shoulders tensed as Brooks stood behind him watching closely, his hand still resting on his holstered weapon. The threat was unmistakable. and it had been there since the moment they stepped out of the car. Tyler could see the storm brewing in Jordan's eyes, the barely restrained fury that had been simmering since the first racially charged word had been thrown their way. Jordan wasn't one to back down easily, especially not in situations like this. "Stay calm," Tyler murmured, his voice low, barely audible as he kept his gaze locked on Miller. He could feel the tension radiating from his partner, and he knew that the situation was dangerously close to boiling over. But Miller and Brooks didn't seem to care about the line they were crossing. If anything, they reveled in the power they held over the two agents, even if they didn't know who they truly were. To these officers, Tyler and Jordan were just two black men in an expensive car, a threat that needed to be neutralized, or at least humiliated. "Step back from the car," Miller ordered, his tone cold and commanding. His hand hovered close to his holster, a clear signal that he was ready to escalate at the slightest hint of resistance. Tyler met Miller's gaze, his expression calm, though his heart pounded in his chest. He knew the game these officers were playing. They were baiting them, trying to provoke a reaction that would justify their aggression. It was a game Tyler and Jordan had seen too many times before. "We're complying," Tyler said, his voice steady but firm. "We haven't done anything wrong." Miller's eyes gleamed with a predatory satisfaction as he stepped even closer, clearly enjoying the control he held over the situation. "That's for us to decide." Without waiting for a response, Miller reached out and opened the driver's side door, peering inside the car with a quick, cursory glance before starting to rifle through the glove compartment. His movements were deliberate, invasive, as if he were searching for something to validate his actions, or worse, plant something that could incriminate them. Tyler's pulse quickened, though he kept his expression neutral. He couldn't afford to show weakness now. He couldn't afford to give these officers any reason to push further. But the weight of the situation was becoming unbearable. They had no warrant, no probable cause, and yet here they were, tearing through the car as if it were a criminal's hideout. Jordan shifted beside him, his jaw clenched so tightly that Tyler could see the muscles in his face twitch. Jordan's temper was legendary, especially when it came to injustices like this. He hated being powerless, hated being treated like a criminal when they were anything but. And now, as Miller rummaged through their car, the frustration was boiling over. "This is bullshit," Jordan muttered under his breath, his voice thick with anger. Tyler shot him a quick glance, a silent plea for restraint. He knew Jordan had every right to be furious, but they couldn't afford to lose control. Not yet. "I know," Tyler whispered, barely audible. "Just hold on." But Jordan was already nearing his breaking point. He took a deep breath, visibly struggling to keep his emotions in check. "They can't just—" "Hey," Miller interrupted, his voice sharp as he pulled something from the glove compartment. He held it up for Brooks to see, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "Look what we've got here." Tyler's heart skipped a beat as Miller waved a small object in the air, a perfectly legal folding knife, the kind that many people carried for simple tasks. But in Miller's hands, it was a weapon, an excuse to turn the situation into something far more dangerous. Brooks chuckled darkly from where he stood behind Jordan. "Well, well, what were you planning to do with that, huh?" "It's a utility knife," Tyler said, his voice measured, though he could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. "It's legal." "Not when it's in the hands of someone like you," Miller shot back, his grin widening as he pocketed the knife, treating it like evidence. The insinuation was clear, and it hit like a punch to the gut. "Someone like you." The words carried the weight of centuries of prejudice, of systemic racism, of the assumption that black men were inherently dangerous, inherently guilty. Jordan's fists clenched at his sides, and Tyler could see the barely contained fury boiling over in his partner's eyes. This wasn't just about the knife. This was about everything. Every time they had been stopped without cause, every time they had been treated like criminals because of the color of their skin, every time the system had failed them. "You can't be serious," Jordan said, his voice trembling with anger. "You're going to arrest us for carrying a damn utility knife?" Miller shrugged, clearly enjoying the power he held. "It's not up to you, is it?" Tyler's breath quickened as he watched the scene unfold, his mind racing through possible scenarios. He could feel the situation slipping out of their control. If they pushed back now, it would give Miller and Brooks exactly what they wanted, a reason to escalate, a reason to use force. But if they didn't push back, who knew how far this would go? And then, without warning, Miller's hand moved to his gun. "Hands on the hood," Miller barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Tyler's stomach dropped. This was it. They were taking this to the next level. "Now," Brooks added, his own hand resting on his weapon as he glared at Jordan with a dangerous intensity. For a split second, Tyler considered his options. He could reveal who they were, flash their badges, and end this nightmare. But that would blow their cover, jeopardize the entire mission. Everything they had worked for could come crashing down if they revealed their true identities now. But if they didn't... Jordan's body tensed beside him. His fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Tyler could see the internal struggle written across his face, the fight between pride and survival. It was a fight they had both been forced to wage too many times. "Do it," Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible as he stepped toward the hood of the car, his hands raised in surrender. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he couldn't let it show. Not now. Jordan hesitated for a moment, his eyes locked on Brooks with a look of pure defiance. But then, slowly, reluctantly, he followed Tyler's lead, placing his hands on the hood of the car as instructed. The air was thick with tension as Miller and Brooks closed in on them, their weapons drawn, their postures aggressive. Tyler could feel the cold metal of the car beneath his palms, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with every breath he took. This was no longer about a traffic stop. This was about power, about control. And these officers were determined to assert theirs. Miller moved in close, his gun hovering just inches from Tyler's back as he barked orders. "Don't move. Don't even think about moving." Tyler's jaw tightened, but he stayed perfectly still. He could feel the heat of Miller's breath on his neck, the weight of the gun that hovered dangerously close to his skin. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to do something, to fight back, to defend himself. But he knew better. He knew how quickly things could go from bad to worse. Jordan, standing beside him, was barely holding it together. Tyler could hear his heavy breathing, could feel the tension radiating from his partner's body. He knew that Jordan was just seconds away from snapping, from saying or doing something that would give these officers the excuse they were looking for. "Easy," Tyler whispered, his voice low and steady. "We'll get through this." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. The situation was teetering on a knife's edge, and it would only take one wrong move to tip it into chaos. Brooks moved in behind Jordan, his hand still on his weapon, his expression filled with cold malice. "You two think you're smart, don't you?" he sneered. "Think you can fool us with your fancy car and your fancy words. But I see right through you." Jordan's hands tightened on the hood of the car, his knuckles white. You don't know anything about us." Brooks's grin widened, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Oh, I know enough." The words were a dagger, sharp and pointed, meant to wound, meant to provoke. And they did. Tyler could feel the tension snapping inside Jordan, the floodgates breaking open as years of pent-up frustration and rage came surging to the surface. "You think you can just—" "Shut up," Miller snapped, cutting Jordan off as he pressed the barrel of his gun against Tyler's back. "I said, don't move." Tyler's breath caught in his throat as he felt the cold steel of the gun pressed against his spine. This was it. This was the moment they had been dreading. He had to do something. Anything. His mind raced, searching for an escape, for a way to defuse the situation without blowing their cover, but every option seemed fraught with danger, every choice a potential disaster. And then, suddenly, it came to him. "Check my pocket," Tyler said, his voice steady despite the fear that coiled tightly in his chest. Miller frowned, his gun still pressed against Tyler's back. "What?" "My back pocket," Tyler repeated, his voice calm but firm. "Check it." There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty in Miller's eyes as he glanced at Brooks. But then, with a sneer, he reached for Tyler's back pocket, his fingers brushing against the leather of Tyler's wallet. And then he froze. Tyler held his breath, waiting. Miller pulled the wallet from Tyler's pocket, flipping it open with a quick flick of his wrist. His eyes widened as he stared down at the badge inside. FBI. The air seemed to shift, the weight of the moment pressing down on them all as the truth sank in. They weren't just two black men in a nice car, they were federal agents. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The dark, empty stretch of road, the flashing red and blue lights, and the cool night air all became a backdrop to the tense silence that hung between them. Tyler could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable, as if the weight of everything that had happened was pressing down on them all at once. Miller stood frozen, his fingers gripping Tyler's wallet, his eyes locked on the FBI badge inside. His face was a mask of disbelief, the cocky confidence he'd worn just moments ago evaporating like steam. Brooks, who had been standing beside Jordan, took a hesitant step forward, his hand still resting on his holstered weapon. His brow furrowed in confusion, his eyes darting between Miller and Tyler as if trying to piece together what had just happened. "What the hell is this?" Miller muttered, his voice shaky, though he tried to mask it with aggression. He held up the badge as if it were a trick, something that couldn't possibly be real. Tyler remained still, his hands still on the hood of the car, his heart pounding in his chest. The cold metal beneath his palms was the only thing grounding him in that moment, keeping him focused. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not yet. Even though the badge had been revealed, even though the truth was now out in the open, the danger hadn't passed. In fact, it had only shifted into a new form. "We're federal agents," Tyler said calmly, though his voice was edged with a steel that hadn't been there before. "FBI." The words seemed to echo in the cold night air, cutting through the silence like a knife. Miller's eyes widened, his face paling as he looked back down at the badge in his hand. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something like panic in his expression, as though the gravity of the situation had finally hit him. He had crossed a line that wasn't easy to come back from. Beside Tyler, Jordan straightened slightly, though he kept his hands where they were, still cautious, still wary of the guns that were drawn on them. His jaw was tight, his body rigid, as though he were holding himself back from saying something he knew he couldn't take back. "We tried to tell you," Jordan said through clenched teeth, his voice low but filled with barely restrained fury. "You didn't listen." Brooks took another step forward, his face flushed with confusion and frustration. He didn't seem to know what to do now. The situation had taken a turn they hadn't anticipated, and for the first time it was clear that they were no longer in control. Miller's hand tightened around the badge, his knuckles white as he struggled to maintain his composure. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. This was a nightmare scenario, the kind of situation that could end careers, that could ruin lives. And he knew it. "You're FBI?" Brooks asked, his voice faltering as he looked from Jordan to Tyler, his eyes wide with disbelief. "This has to be some kind of joke." "It's not a joke," Tyler replied firmly, his voice calm but unyielding. "We're agents, and you've just made a very big mistake." The truth of those words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Brooks blinked rapidly, his hand finally leaving the grip of his gun as he took a step back, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. Miller, however, wasn't ready to back down just yet. He stood his ground, his jaw clenched as his mind raced to find a way out of this. This doesn't mean anything," Miller spat, his voice filled with a mix of desperation and denial. "Badges don't make you untouchable." Jordan's eyes flashed with anger, and Tyler could feel the tension radiating from his partner. They had been through hell tonight, humiliated, threatened, and nearly arrested for no reason other than the color of their skin. And now, even after revealing their status as federal agents, they were still being challenged, still being treated like they didn't belong. "Are you serious right now?" Jordan growled, his voice rising with barely contained fury. "We're FBI agents, and you're still pulling this crap? You've crossed a line, man. You've crossed so many lines you can't even see where they started." Miller's grip on the badge tightened, his face flushed with anger as he glared at Jordan. "Don't talk to me like that," he snarled, his hand inching closer to his gun. "I'm still the one in control here." "No, you're not," Tyler cut in, his voice sharp and commanding. "You're not in control anymore, Officer Miller, and if you don't de-escalate this situation right now, it's going to get a lot worse for you." The weight of those words seemed to hit Miller like a punch to the gut. He stood there for a moment, frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, frustration. But deep down, he knew Tyler was right. He wasn't in control anymore. He had lost it the moment he had crossed that line, the moment he had ignored their rights, their humanity, and now their authority. Brooks, who had been standing off to the side, took a shaky breath, his expression filled with something that looked like regret. He glanced nervously at Miller, as though waiting for him to make the next move, but it was clear that the situation had shifted beyond what either of them had anticipated. "Miller, maybe we should—" Brooks started, but Miller cut him off with a sharp gesture, his eyes still burning with defiance. "No," Miller snapped, though his voice had lost some of its bite. "We're not letting them walk just because they flash some badges. We still don't know what they're doing out here." Tyler's jaw clenched, his patience wearing thin. "We're federal agents on assignment," he said slowly, enunciating each word with deliberate force. "We've been undercover for months, and your actions tonight have jeopardized an ongoing investigation. If you don't back down right now, you'll be facing charges. This is obstruction, abuse of power, and racial profiling. You're not going to win this." Miller stared at Tyler, his face flushed with rage, but the fight in him was slowly draining away. He knew Tyler was right. He knew there was no coming back from this. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, as the two officers stood frozen in place, grappling with the reality of the situation. Tyler's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his composure, his hands still resting on the hood of the car, waiting for the next move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Miller let out a sharp breath, his hand dropping from his gun. He held the FBI badge in his hand for a moment longer before tossing it onto the hood of the car with a bitter sneer. "Get out of here," Miller muttered, his voice low and filled with barely restrained anger. "You're lucky we're letting you go." Tyler's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. This wasn't the time for a confrontation. They had achieved what they needed. The situation was de-escalating, even if it was in the most bitter and begrudging way possible. Beside him, Jordan straightened up, his body still tense with the adrenaline that had been coursing through him. He shot a look at Brooks, who had taken another step back, his face pale and drawn, clearly shaken by everything that had happened. "We're leaving," Tyler said, his voice calm but authoritative. "But this isn't over. You'll be hearing from us again." Miller didn't respond. He simply turned away, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with frustration. Brooks, on the other hand, nodded stiffly, as though finally understanding the gravity of what had transpired. Without another word, Tyler and Jordan stepped away from the hood of the car, their hearts still racing, their bodies still tense. As they climbed back into their vehicle, the flashing lights of the police cruiser still casting an eerie glow through the night, the weight of the encounter settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Jordan slammed the door shut, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he stared out at the empty road ahead. "I can't believe that just happened," he muttered, his voice thick with frustration. Tyler nodded slowly, his own hands resting on his knees as he took a deep breath, trying to calm the pounding in his chest. "I know," he said quietly, "but we got through it." "They didn't even apologize," Jordan growled, his knuckles white against the leather of the steering wheel. "They didn't care. Even after seeing our badges, they didn't care." Tyler didn't have an answer for that. He knew Jordan was right. Miller and Brooks hadn't cared. They hadn't seen them as men. As fellow law enforcement officers, they had seen them as threats, as black men who needed to be put in their place. "It's not over," Tyler said, his voice firm. "We'll make sure they face the consequences for this." Jordan nodded, though his face was still tight with anger. "They'll pay for this. They have to." Tyler's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, where the flashing lights of the police cruiser still glowed in the distance. They had survived the encounter, but the scars of what had just happened were fresh, raw, and deep. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning after the encounter with Officers Miller and Brooks dawned cold and gray. The tension of the previous night still clung to Tyler and Jordan as they drove to the FBI field office, the weight of what had happened pressing heavily on their shoulders. It wasn't the first time they had experienced racial profiling, not by a long shot, but this time was different. This time, it wasn't just about them. It was about the mission they had been on, the operation that had been jeopardized, and the fundamental question of justice they now had to confront. As the car glided through the city streets, Tyler remained quiet, his mind replaying the events of the night before. The moment Miller had pulled his gun, the way Brooks had stood there, complicit in the whole thing. Even after the badges had been shown, after the truth had been revealed, there had been no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no apology. It was as if the mere fact of their skin color had canceled out their authority, their status, their humanity. Beside him, Jordan's jaw was set in a hard line, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His anger was palpable, like a coiled spring ready to snap at any moment. "I'm filing a complaint the minute we get in there," Jordan muttered, breaking the silence. "No way those bastards get away with this." Tyler glanced at him, knowing exactly how he felt. He shared that anger, that burning sense of injustice, but he also knew that this situation was delicate. They were in the midst of one of the most important undercover operations of their careers, and anything they did now could have far-reaching consequences, not just for them, but for the entire Bureau. "I know," Tyler said calmly, though inside he was just as furious. "But we need to be smart about this. We can't let them derail what we've been working on for months." Jordan shot him a look, his eyes flashing with anger. "Smart? We were almost shot last night, Tyler. They didn't care about anything. Not who we were, not what we were doing. They didn't even care that we were law enforcement. They saw 2 black men, and that was it. Game over." Tyler took a deep breath, his hands resting on his knees as he stared out the window. He knew Jordan was right. Every word was true. But they couldn't afford to act rashly. Not now. "We'll file a complaint," Tyler said firmly. "We'll make sure they're held accountable. But we need to do it by the book. We can't let this turn into something that compromises the mission. If this blows up in the wrong way, it could backfire. And Miller and Brooks could walk away without a scratch." Jordan let out a frustrated sigh, but he didn't argue. He knew Tyler was right, even if it grated against everything he was feeling. They had to be careful. They had to play this the right way. By the time they arrived at the field office, the morning bustle was in full swing. Agents moved quickly through the halls, phones ringing, conversations buzzing around them. But for Tyler and Jordan, the noise seemed distant, muted by the weight of what they were about to do. They made their way to the office of Special Agent in Charge, David Hernandez, the man who had overseen the entire operation from the beginning. Hernandez was a no-nonsense leader, someone who valued results, but also understood the importance of doing things the right way. He had been a mentor to both Tyler and Jordan, and they knew he would take their concerns seriously. As they entered the office, Hernandez looked up from his desk, his sharp eyes immediately picking up on the tension between them. He gestured for them to sit down, folding his hands on the desk as he waited for them to speak. "What's going on?" Hernandez asked, his tone direct. Tyler exchanged a glance with Jordan before speaking. "We had an incident last night. After the meeting with our informant, we were pulled over by 2 local officers. They racially profiled us. It got bad, Hernandez. Real bad." Hernandez's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened with concern. "Tell me everything." Tyler and Jordan took turns recounting the events of the night, from the moment they had been pulled over to the point where Miller had pulled his gun, and finally to the revelation of their FBI badges. As they spoke, Hernandez listened in silence, his face growing grimmer with each detail. When they finished, there was a long, heavy pause. Hernandez sat back in his chair, rubbing his chin as he processed everything they had told him. "This isn't just about us," Tyler said finally, breaking the silence. "They jeopardized the entire operation. If we hadn't kept our cool, if we had been forced to reveal our identities any sooner, it could have blown everything. And they didn't care. Not once." Hernandez nodded slowly. "You're right. This goes beyond a simple traffic stop. These officers put an active FBI investigation at risk. They'll have to answer for that." Jordan leaned forward, his fists clenched on his knees. "We need to take this public, Hernandez. This can't be something that gets swept under the rug. They almost killed us. They need to be held accountable." Hernandez raised a hand, signaling for Jordan to hold off. I understand your anger, Jordan. Believe me, I do. But going public isn't the answer, not yet. Jordan's brow furrowed, frustration etched into his features. What do you mean, not yet? We can't just let them get away with this. We won't, Hernandez said firmly. But we need to handle this internally first. We'll file the necessary complaints, and I'll make sure an internal investigation is opened. But if this goes public too soon, it could compromise the entire operation. We need to be strategic about how we handle this. Tyler nodded in agreement, though he could still feel the knot of anger tightening in his chest. And what happens to Miller and Brooks? They can't walk away from this. They won't, Hernandez promised. I'll make sure of that. But you need to trust me. Let me handle this. Jordan sat back in his chair, his jaw clenched in frustration. He hated feeling like this, like there was no immediate justice. But he knew Hernandez was right. They couldn't afford to act impulsively. Fine, Jordan muttered, but they'd better not get a slap on the wrist. They won't, Hernandez said again, his tone leaving no room for doubt. I'll handle it. You two focus on the operation. We're too close to the end to let this derail everything. With that, the meeting ended. Tyler and Jordan left Hernandez's office, the weight of the encounter still heavy on their shoulders. They had done the right thing, taken the right steps. But it didn't feel like enough. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and frustration. Tyler and Jordan kept their heads down, focusing on the final stages of their operation, but the shadow of what had happened with Miller and Brooks loomed over them. The internal investigation was opened, just as Hernandez had promised, but the process was slow. Too slow for Jordan's liking. Every day that passed without consequences for the officers felt like another insult, another reminder of how easily the system could fail them. Then, one afternoon, as they were sitting in the break room, Hernandez walked in, his expression unreadable. You two, he said, nodding toward his office. Now. Tyler and Jordan exchanged a look before following him. As soon as they were inside the office, Hernandez shut the door behind them and turned to face them, his arms crossed over his chest. They're coming in, Hernandez said, his voice low. Tyler frowned. Who? Miller and Brooks, Hernandez replied. I've pulled some strings. We're going to confront them here, in front of the department. They'll be forced to explain themselves. Jordan's eyes widened. Here? Publicly? Hernandez nodded. It's not going to be a quiet internal investigation anymore. This is going to be out in the open. The weight of his words sank in, and Tyler felt a flicker of satisfaction. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when Miller and Brooks would be forced to face the truth, to face the consequences of their actions. The next day, the conference room in the FBI field office was packed. Agents from every department had gathered, word of the confrontation having spread quickly through the ranks. Tyler and Jordan stood near the front, their arms crossed as they waited for Miller and Brooks to arrive. When the doors finally opened, the room fell silent. Miller and Brooks walked in, their faces pale, their eyes scanning the room with a mixture of fear and defiance. It was clear that they hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to be called out in front of the entire department. Hernandez stepped forward, his expression cold and authoritative. Officers Miller and Brooks, he began, his voice carrying through the room. You are here today to explain your actions from the night of the traffic stop involving 2 FBI agents. Your conduct has been called into question, and we expect full accountability. Miller's face flushed, his jaw tightening as he shifted uncomfortably. Brooks, standing beside him, looked like he wanted to disappear. Tyler watched them closely, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes locked on Miller. This was it. The moment when the truth would finally come to light. Miller swallowed hard, his voice shaking as he spoke. We didn't know who they were. We were just following procedure. Jordan scoffed, shaking his head. Procedure? You call what you did procedure? Hernandez raised a hand to silence the room. Officers, you had no probable cause to stop them, and yet you escalated the situation to the point where lethal force was nearly used. You jeopardized an ongoing FBI operation. That's not procedure. That's abuse of power. Miller's face paled even further, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find the words. Brooks stood beside him, silent, his head down. You treated us like criminals, Tyler said, his voice low but filled with conviction. Even after we showed you our badges, you refused to de-escalate. You crossed the line. There was a long, heavy pause as the weight of Tyler's words settled over the room. Finally, Miller looked up, his eyes filled with something that almost looked like regret. We didn't mean for it to go that far. We made a mistake. A mistake? Jordan repeated, his voice sharp. That's all you've got to say? Miller swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Hernandez as if searching for a way out. But there was no escape now. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. Hernandez stepped forward, his voice cold and unyielding. You will be held accountable for your actions. An official report will be filed, and disciplinary action will be taken. This department does not tolerate racial profiling or abuse of power. The room was silent, the weight of those words hanging in the air. Tyler and Jordan stood tall, their eyes locked on Miller and Brooks. They had fought for this moment, fought for justice. And now they had won, but it wasn't over yet. As the meeting came to a close and Miller and Brooks were escorted out of the room, Tyler felt a sense of resolution settle over him. They had taken the first step. The truth had come to light. But the fight for justice was far from over. This was just the beginning. The days following the confrontation in the FBI field office were filled with a tense but expectant quiet. For Tyler and Jordan, the weight of their encounter with Miller and Brooks lingered, but there was also a sense of finality. The public reckoning had come, and the system, at least in this instance, was responding the way it was supposed to. The disciplinary process began almost immediately. Internal Affairs opened an investigation into Miller and Brooks, and the evidence of their misconduct was irrefutable. Every agent who had been present in that conference room, every officer who had heard the testimony, knew that what had transpired on that dark highway had gone beyond procedure. It was a blatant abuse of power, and it had nearly cost Tyler and Jordan their lives. Now, the system would hold those responsible accountable, or at least that was the hope. As Tyler sat at his desk, staring at the report he had just finished writing, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Miller and Brooks were just two officers in a much larger system, a system that had been built on centuries of prejudice, a system that still struggled to recognize and root out its own biases. The thought weighed heavily on him. Jordan, sitting across from him, was typing furiously on his own laptop, no doubt finishing his report for the investigation. The anger that had burned so brightly in Jordan after the incident had dulled to a simmer, but it was still there, just beneath the surface. Tyler knew that his partner wasn't satisfied with just an internal investigation. Jordan wanted real change, something more lasting than a temporary suspension or a quiet reassignment. "You think they'll actually follow through?" Jordan asked suddenly, breaking the silence in the office. His fingers stilled on the keyboard as he looked up at Tyler, his eyes searching for reassurance. Tyler leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "They have to," he said, though the weight of his words felt heavier than he intended. "The whole department saw what happened. If they don't, it's going to be a disaster for them. The FBI can't afford to look like it's covering up something like this." Jordan scoffed, leaning back in his own chair. "They've covered up worse." There was a bitterness in Jordan's voice that Tyler understood all too well. They had both seen the system fail, not just once, but time and time again. They had seen officers get away with abuse, seen the victims of racial profiling pushed aside, ignored, and silenced. The system, for all its promises of justice, had never been built to protect people like them. But now, sitting in the heart of it, they had a chance to push for something different. "Not this time," Tyler said quietly. "We're not going to let it happen this time." Jordan stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right," he muttered. "We can't let this slide. If they try to sweep it under the rug, we'll make sure it doesn't stay there." Tyler gave a small nod, knowing that Jordan's determination was one of the reasons they had gotten this far. He admired his partner's fire, his unwillingness to back down even in the face of overwhelming odds. That fire had kept them both going, even when the road seemed impossible to navigate. A knock on the door interrupted the moment, and both men looked up as Special Agent in Charge Hernandez stepped into the office. His face was unreadable, but there was a certain tension in his posture that told Tyler the news he was about to deliver was important. "Hernandez," Tyler said, sitting up straighter. "What's going on?" Hernandez stepped further into the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "I just came from a meeting with Internal Affairs," he said, his voice measured. "The investigation into Miller and Brooks is complete." Jordan straightened in his chair, his eyes narrowing with anticipation. "And?" Hernandez let out a slow breath before continuing. "Both officers have been suspended without pay, pending further disciplinary action. They'll be required to undergo mandatory training on racial profiling and implicit bias. There's also talk of reassignment, but there's something else." Tyler felt a sinking feeling in his chest as Hernandez hesitated. He exchanged a glance with Jordan, who was already frowning, his fists clenched at his sides. "What is it?" Tyler asked, his voice steady but edged with tension. Hernandez sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Internal Affairs is recommending that the issue be handled quietly. They don't want a media frenzy over this, not with everything else going on. The department is already under scrutiny for other cases, and they're worried that if this goes public, it quiet." Jordan's voice was sharp, filled with disbelief. "They want to handle this quietly? After everything that happened?" Hernandez held up a hand, trying to calm him. "Look, I don't like it either, but this is coming from higher up. They don't want a scandal." Tyler's jaw tightened as he processed the information. He had expected consequences for Miller and Brooks, but this? A quiet resolution, swept under the rug to avoid bad press? It felt like a betrayal, not just to him and Jordan, but to everyone who had been subjected to the same kind of treatment and never had the chance to speak out. "So what?" Jordan said, his voice rising. "They get a slap on the wrist, and then they're back on the streets? No one's going to know what they did, how they nearly killed us?" "Jordan," Hernandez said firmly, his voice calm but commanding. "I understand your frustration, but the decision isn't final yet. There's still time to push back. I'm not giving up on this, and neither should you." Tyler glanced at Jordan, seeing the barely contained fury in his partner's eyes. He felt it too, that burning sense of injustice. But they had to be strategic. They couldn't afford to let their emotions drive their actions. Not now. "What can we do?" Tyler asked, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "How do we make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug?" Hernandez met his gaze, his expression hardening with determination. "We push. We don't let this go. The internal investigation is just the first step. If they try to silence this, we go public. We leak the story if we have to. The media will take it and run with it. There's no way the department can ignore it then." Jordan's eyes widened slightly. "You're serious? You'd risk your career for this?" Hernandez gave a grim smile. "I've seen enough in this job to know that some things are worth fighting for. This is one of them." There was a long silence as the weight of Hernandez's words settled over the room. Tyler felt a sense of clarity washing over him, a renewed determination to see this through to the end. They had come too far, endured too much, to let the system protect its own at the expense of justice. "Then we fight," Tyler said firmly, his voice filled with resolve. "Whatever it takes." Jordan nodded, his eyes burning with the same fire. "Whatever it takes." Over the next few weeks, the tension around the case only grew. Tyler and Jordan continued to focus on their undercover work, but the shadow of what had happened with Miller and Brooks loomed over everything they did. The internal investigation moved slowly, and every day that passed without real consequences for the officers felt like another slap in the face. But they didn't give up. Behind the scenes, Hernandez worked tirelessly to push the case forward, gathering support from other agents, building a coalition of voices who demanded accountability. And, slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. One afternoon, as Tyler and Jordan were sitting in the office, Hernandez burst in, a look of triumph on his face. "It's happening," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "The department is going public with the case. Miller and Brooks are being officially reprimanded, and the story is going to hit the media tomorrow. They couldn't keep it quiet anymore." Jordan shot out of his chair, a grin spreading across his face. "Are you serious?" Hernandez nodded. "We did it. The media is going to run the story, and the department has no choice but to own up to it. This isn't getting buried." Tyler felt a wave of relief wash over him. Finally, after weeks of waiting, of fighting, of pushing back against the system, justice was coming. Miller and Brooks would be held accountable. The truth would come out. "Good," Tyler said quietly, though the intensity in his voice was unmistakable. "They'll finally have to answer for what they did." The next day, the headlines were everywhere. News outlets ran stories about the racial profiling incident, about how 2 FBI agents had been stopped, threatened, and nearly arrested by officers who had abused their power. The public outcry was immediate and intense, and within hours the department was forced to issue a public statement acknowledging the misconduct. Miller and Brooks were officially suspended, pending further investigation. It wasn't the end, not yet, but it was a victory, a step in the right direction. As Tyler and Jordan sat together in their office, watching the news reports come in, they exchanged a look of quiet satisfaction. They had fought for this, and they had won. But they both knew that this wasn't the end of the battle. "This isn't over," Jordan said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "We've got a long way to go." Tyler nodded. "But it's a start." They had faced down the system, pushed back against the injustice they had endured, and come out on the other side. And now, as the world took notice, they knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice, for accountability, for change, it would continue. But they were ready for it. Whatever came next, they would be ready. Thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new exciting stories. Click on the next video to continue watching. We've got a lot more exciting things to come.